This is Unit 8, Human Health and Pollution PowerPoint. Toxicology is the study of chemical risks. It looks at how these substances affect living organisms and looks at the diagnosis and treatment of exposure to toxins. Neurotoxins are chemicals that disrupt the nervous systems of animals. Insecticides are a common example. They paralyze the insect's nervous system and they suffocate to death. Lead and mercury are also neurotoxins. Removing lead from gasoline has helped bring down lead exposure, but it's still a problem in old houses with lead-based paint. Carcinogens are chemicals that cause cancer. They cause cell damage and lead to uncontrolled cell growth, which is a tumor, either by interfering with the normal metabolic processes of the cell or by damaging the genetic material. Mutagens are carcinogens that cause damage to the genetic material of a cell. Asbestos, radon, arsenic, formaldehyde, Pcbs, and vinyl chloride are all carcinogens. Pcbs are a class of chlorine-containing compounds. They're a persistent organic pollutant. Once they have entered an animal's body, they're fat soluble, so they become part of their body. So really the best way to avoid ingesting PCBs is to trim off the fat of fish before you eat them. They absorb them from the water that they live in. Teratogens are chemicals that interfere with the normal development of embryos or fetuses. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women in the 50s and 60s for nausea, and tens of thousands of children were born with photochemical, which means malformed upper limbs. About half died. Other effects included deformed eyes and hearts, deformed digestive systems and urinary tracts, blindness and deafness. It was removed from the market in 1961 and is now used to treat leprosy and multiple myeloma cancers. Excessive alcohol consumption during pregnancy reduces fetal growth and damages the brain and can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. Allergens are a group of chemicals that cause allergic reactions. They're not pathogens but cause abnormally high immune system response. They can cause breathing difficulties and even death. Peanuts, milk, sugar, penicillin, and codeine are common examples. Dose-response studies expose animals or plants to different amounts of a chemical and then observe a variety of possible responses, including mortality or changes in behavior or reproduction. Concentration is the amount of chemical that can be measured in the air, water, or food, whereas dose is the amount of chemical that is absorbed or consumed by an organism. Acute studies are short experiments. Dose-response studies usually last only 1 to 4 days. Most commonly measure mortality as a response. At the end of the study, scientists count how many individuals die after exposure to each concentration and graph the data. It usually makes an S-shaped curve. You can see that curve in the graph here. Threshold is the dose at which an effect can be detected. LD50 is an abbreviation for lethal dose that kills 50% of the individuals. It helps to determine the relative toxicity of a chemical compared to other chemicals. These studies are usually conducted on rodents and then extrapolated to humans and other mammals. Sublethal effects alter the behavior of an individual due to the chemical acting as a teratogen, carcinogen, or neurotoxin. ED50 is the effective dose that causes 50% of the individuals to display harmful but non-lethal effects. The Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976 gives the EPA the authority to regulate many chemicals, though excluding food, cosmetics, and pesticides. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gives the U.S. Food and Drug Administration the authority to oversee the safety of food, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics. The Delaney Clause of this act prohibits the FDA from approving the use of any food additive found to cause cancer in animals or humans. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act of 1996 regulates pesticides. A manufacturer must demonstrate that a pesticide will not generally cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. Scientists test bird, mammal, fish, and invertebrate they deem most sensitive to a particular chemical. so that if they are protected, then all the members of that phylum or order will be protected. Test results from fish are extrapolated out to reptiles and amphibians, but because both those orders are experiencing population declines, there is increased interest and required tests for them as well. For most animals, a safe concentration is obtained by taking the LD50 value and dividing it by 10, because 10% of the lethal dose should cause few animals to die. For humans, the LD50 and ED50 values are divided by 1,000 to set safe values for humans. Chronic studies are toxicology studies that are conducted for long periods of time. They often last from the time an organism is very young to when it is old enough to reproduce. The goal is to examine long-term effects of chemicals, including survival and reproduction. Epidemiology is a field of science that strives to understand the causes of illness and disease in human and wildlife populations. Epidemiologists examine large populations of humans or animals who are exposed to chemicals in their everyday lives, then determines whether their exposures are associated with any health problems. Looking at this map here of Virginia, you're looking at outbreaks of food poisoning, and they have the circled areas are the centers of the food poisoning. Retrospective studies monitor people who have been exposed to a chemical at some time in the past. They are compared to a group of people who have not been exposed. Both are monitored for several years to see if the exposed group has more health problems. In 1984, a Union Carbide factory in Bhopal, India, accidentally released methyl isocyanate gas, which is a pesticide. 2,000 people died that night, 15,000 people later from exposure. About 100,000 people are still experiencing respiratory symptoms, stillbirths, genetic abnormalities, and high rates of infant mortality, kidney failure, and learning disabilities. Prospective studies monitor people who might become exposed to harmful chemicals in the future. People are asked to keep track of diet, tobacco and alcohol use, and other habits for as long as 40 years to determine if they are associated with health problems. Children were followed for the effects of lead exposure from 6 months to 5 years. After controlling for mother's IQ, exposure to tobacco, and intellectual environment in the home, it was determined that children exposed to lead dust and consumed lead paint chips scored lower on IQ tests. Synergistic interactions occur when two risks together cause more harm than one would based on their individual risks. An example would be the impact of asbestos while smoking. An environmental hazard is anything in our environment that can potentially cause harm. This includes pollutants, chemical contaminants, human activities such as deforestation or habitat destruction, or natural disasters such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Dysentery is an inflammation of the intestines caused by bacteria Shigella or protists entamoeba that cause bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramping, nausea, and vomiting. Dysentery is spread by fecal contamination of food and water, mainly through the release of untreated sewage into rivers and streams. Worldwide, approximately 140 million people develop dysentery every year, and about 600,000 die. Most of these deaths occur in developing countries among children under 5. Mesothelioma is a tumor that forms in the lining of the lungs, stomach, heart, and other organs. Malignant mesothelioma is a type of cancer that forms mainly from the inhalation of asbestos fibers. It takes a relatively long time to form after exposure to asbestos. Occupational asbestos exposure accounts for most of the world's exposure to asbestos. Due to banning in industrialized countries, asbestos exposure has decreased in those countries. Developing countries continue to use, produce, and export asbestos. Photochemical oxidants are formed as a result of sunlight acting on compounds such as NOx and sulfur dioxide. It's harmful to plant tissue, human respiratory tissue, and construction materials. Ozone is the most abundant photochemical oxidant in the troposphere. It is harmful to plants and animals and causes asthma and emphysema. Smog is a mixture of oxidants and particulate matter. Photochemical smog, which is also called Los Angeles type smog or brown smog, is mostly composed of oxidants like ozone. Sulfurous smog, or London type smog, also called gray smog, is mostly sulfur dioxide and sulfate compounds from burning coal. The atmospheric brown cloud is a combination of particulate matter and ozone derived primarily from combustion of fossil fuels and biomass. The cloud is currently drifting over the Pacific Ocean from Asia towards western United States. Qualitative judgments are based on perception. People's or quantitative judgment of risk is based on data, and a lot of times people's perception does not match up with the data. To manage risk effectively, we need to determine how closely our perceptions match reality. Example, you are more likely statistically to die in a car crash than a plane crash. Causes of death in the U.S. are calculated based on death statistics kept by the government. People generally perceive disasters that receive more media attention, like a nuclear plant meltdown or a plane crash, as having a higher risk factor when they actually have a lower risk factor. Quantitative risk assessment is based on real data versus perception. The risk of a rare event that has a high likelihood of causing harm can be equal to the risk of a common event that has a low likelihood of causing harm. This uses tremendous amounts of data from acute and chronic dose response experiments, retrospective studies, and prospective studies. Estimates of concentrations of a chemical found in nature, routes of exposure, solubility, persistence, and the potential for the chemical to bioaccumulate or biomagnify. Risk acceptance is the level of risk that can be tolerated. The EPA says a 1 in 1 million risk is acceptable for most environmental hazards. This is very controversial and open to personal preferences of risk acceptance, and it's based on environmental science, economics, and worldviews. Risk management seeks to balance possible harm against other considerations. It integrates the scientific data on risk assessment and the analysis of acceptable levels of risk with a number of additional factors, including economic, social, ethical, and political issues. It's regulated by local, national, or international government agencies. For example, the amount of arsenic in drinking water varies greatly worldwide, and a balance must be struck between the scientific data and economic interests. There are 80,000 registered chemicals in the world that are not regulated in the same way around the globe. The innocent until proven guilty principle is based on the philosophy that a potential hazard should not be considered a hazard until the scientific data can be definitively demonstrate that a potential hazard actually causes harm. This allows beneficial chemicals to be introduced more quickly. Harmful chemicals can affect humans or wildlife for decades before sufficient scientific evidence accumulates to confirm they are harmful, however. And this is most commonly used in the U.S. The precautionary principle is based on the philosophy that when a hazard is plausible but not yet certain, we should take actions to reduce or remove the hazard. There is a trade-off between greater safety with slower introduction of beneficial chemicals versus greater potential risk with a greater rate of discovery of helpful chemicals. And this was instituted in the EU in 2000. The Stockholm Convention is an agreement between 127 nations to restrict the global use of some chemicals. It produced a list of 12 chemicals known as the Dirty Dozen to be banned, phased out, or reduced. DDT, Pcbs, and other pesticides and byproducts of manufacturing are all endocrine disruptors. REACH was established in 2007 by the 27 nations of the EU to regulate chemicals. It stands for the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. It embraces the precautionary principle by putting more responsibility on chemical manufacturers to confirm that chemicals used in the environment pose no risk to people or the environment. It is being phased in over several years to permit sufficient data, time for chemical manufacturers to complete the required testing. There are three major categories of risks that can harm human health: physical, biological, and chemical. Biological risks are associated with disease. A disease is any impaired function of the body with a characteristic set of symptoms. Infectious diseases are those caused by infectious agents known as pathogens. Pathogens include viruses, bacteria, protists, and parasitic worms. 6 types of illnesses that account for 94% of infectious deaths include respiratory infection, AIDS, diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, malaria, and childhood diseases. Chronic diseases slowly impair the functioning of a person's body. Examples are heart disease or cancer. Acute diseases rapidly impair the function of a person's body. An example of that is Ebola. Top risk factors in low-income countries leading to chronic disease are linked to poverty, such as unsafe drinking water, poor sanitation, and malnutrition. Malnourished children are more likely to succumb to pneumonia or diarrhea. Risk factors in high-income countries include tobacco, less active lifestyles, poor nutrition, overeating, high blood pressure, and obesity. Infectious diseases have killed large numbers of people. An epidemic is when a pathogen causes a rapid increase in disease. A pandemic occurs over a large geographic region, such as an entire continent. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 infected 500 million people worldwide. That was about a third of the planet's population at the time, and killed 20 to 50 million victims. Plague, also known as bubonic plague or Black Death, is caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that is carried by fleas and transmitted by their bite. Victims experience swollen glands, black spots on the skin, extreme pain. It killed nearly a quarter of the European population in the 1300s. The last major pandemic was in Asia in the 1990s. Still, small outbreaks occasionally occur. Malaria is caused by an infection from one of several protists in the genus Plasmodium. It spends one life stage inside a mosquito, its vector, and the other inside a human. Regions hardest hit include sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America. It was eradicated from the U.S. in the 1950s with pesticides such as DDT. Problems with malaria that have been on the rise since the 1970s include drug-resistant plasmodium and insect-resistant mosquitoes. People are also clearing more tropical forests, and AIDS patients are particularly vulnerable. Really, the best way to keep from contracting malaria is sleeping under a mosquito net to avoid the bite of an infected mosquito. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, that primarily infects the lungs. It's spread when an infected person coughs and expels the bacteria in the air. Symptoms include weakness, night sweats, coughing up blood. It's estimated a third of the world's population is infected with TB but never develops symptoms. 9 million people contract it annually and 2 million die from it. It can be readily treated with a year-long course of antibiotics that are available in developed countries, but sometimes patients stop taking their antibiotics before the last bacteria has been killed. This allows the pathogen to quickly rebuild its population, and these are generally the most drug-resistant bacteria, leading to a drug-resistant strain of TB. Drug-resistant TB is a major concern in parts of Africa and Russia, especially in their prison system. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae that infects the digestive tract. It's spread through consuming contaminated water or food. Symptoms include watery diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. Severe loss of fluids can lead to death. Cholera is not common in industrialized countries, but developing countries continue to experience outbreaks due to lack of access to clean water and problems with sanitation infrastructure. 3 to 5 million people contract it annually, and 100 to 120,000 die from it. Mortality is highest among children under 5. It can be treated with antibiotics and fluid replacement, and the U.S. currently has a vaccine for it. Emergent infectious diseases are infectious diseases that were previously not described or have not been common for the last prior 20 years. We've seen an average of one new disease emerge annually since the 1970s. Many of these pathogens have jumped from another animal host and into humans because of the ability to mutate. In the late 1970s, rare types of pneumonia and cancer began appearing in individuals with weak immune systems. The condition was named Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. In 1983, the virus was discovered that causes the weakened immune system and named the human immunodeficiency virus. The virus is transmitted through sex, blood transfusion, and sharing dirty needles. In 2006, researchers found genetically similar virus in chimpanzees in Cameroon. Eating primates, called bushmeat, is common in this part of the world, and it is suspected this is how the virus jumped hosts. More than 33 million people are infected with HIV, and 25 million have died from AIDS-related illnesses. Many antivirals are used to reduce the risk of resistance evolution in the virus, but these drugs are expensive. Shown here, Robert Gallo and Luc Montagnier, who both discovered the virus about the same time. Here's a graveyard in South Africa, which has seen the most losses from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Ebola was discovered in 1976 in the Congo near the Ebola River. It infects humans and non-human primates in Central Africa. Outbreaks are sporadic, but the death rate is 50 to 89%. Victims experience fever, vomiting, and internal and external bleeding. Death occurs within 2 weeks. There are no drugs available to fight the disease, and the host is still unknown. Mad cow disease is also known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE. It's a neurological disease first described in the 1980s. The pathogen slowly damages the nervous system, coordination is lost, and then death occurs. The disease is caused by prions, which are small beneficial proteins found in the brain that mutate into proteins that act as pathogens. Prions are difficult to destroy by cooking. Humans who ate infected beef developed the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It was a common practice in Europe at the time to feed ground-up remains of slaughter cattle to farm animals for additional protein. In Britain, 180,000 cattle were infected. 166 people died by 2009. British beef was banned for export in 1996, and tens of thousands of cattle were destroyed. It is now illegal to feed animal remains to cattle. BSE has been found in cows in the U.S. and Canada, but not humans. The Spanish flu that killed 100 million people in 1918 was a type of avian influenza caused by the H1N1 virus. It is rarely deadly to wild birds, but lethal to domesticated poultry. As of 2009, more than 400 people have been infected, and more than half of those died. Large numbers of poultry were destroyed, and it's feared if it mutates again, it has the potential risk to kill 150 million people. West Nile virus lives in hundreds of species of birds and is transmitted by mosquito, lethal to some species of birds, horses, and humans. The first human death was in 1937 in Uganda in the West Nile region. It causes inflammation of the brain, leading to illness and death. It first appeared in New York in 1999 and quickly spread across the U.S. SARS is a viral respiratory illness caused by a coronavirus. It's spread when an infected person coughs and expels the virus in the air. An outbreak began in Asia in 2003 and spread to countries in North and South America and Europe. 774 people died, over 8,000 were infected. Symptoms include high fever, headache, body aches, dry cough, and usually pneumonia. No outbreaks have been reported since 2004. MERS is a viral respiratory illness caused by another type of coronavirus. It's spread through close contact with an infected person's respiratory secretions. It likely came from an animal source in the Arabian Peninsula and is known to be transferred from camels to humans. Symptoms include fever, cough, shortness of breath, and can lead to pneumonia and kidney failure. It has a 30 to 40% mortality rate. No outbreaks have been reported since 2015. There is no vaccine available at this time. Zika is spread mostly by the bite of an infected Aedes species mosquito, but can also be spread through sex and possibly blood transfusions. Zika can be passed from mother to fetus and causes microcephaly and other brain defects and may lead to miscarriages and stillbirth. Zika was first discovered in the Zika forest in Uganda in 1947, and outbreaks of Zika have been reported in tropical Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands since 1952. Symptoms include fever, rash, joint and muscle pain, headaches, and red eyes. There is no vaccine available at this time. To combat diseases in low-income countries, the primary needs are improvements in nutrition, wider availability of clean drinking water, and proper sanitation. In high-income countries, increased physical activity, balanced diets, and limiting tobacco use are needed to improve health. Education about emerging infectious diseases needs to continue in all countries.